Thank you for joining us today, and I will have some questions about the overall situation and about NATO. The first question is, of course, this is the first summit these countries, the members of NATO, got together after 2019 London summit. And since then, many things have changed. Global pandemic that we have never seen for the last 100 years, and US elections, right, which has significant impact on NATO. Do you think this period this 18 months since 2019 December has been transformative for NATO?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for having me here in sunny Brussels. It's great. About your question, I think these last months of COVID have been extremely transformative. Mm-hmm. And when we compare 2019 in London and today in Brussels, the two NATO summits, we see a lot of differences. Mm-hmm. Number one, we see a massive difference in the approach of the United States, mm-hmm. and which is one of the leading countries within NATO. When we look at the summit statement from 2019 in London, there were, 7-9 points, about 4,000 or 5,000 words. Yeah. Whereas in today's statement, we're looking at 79 points. Mm-hmm. We're looking at 15,000 words, triple. Yeah. And you see words like China come up many times, 10 times, as opposed to 2019. The first time it was mentioned as a country in the communication or in the declaration. And so that's a massive change. And that has to do, of course, with the election of a Democrat in the United States that's willing to take a multilateral approach. But it also has to do with how some of the trade wars which have taken place in the last few years between the United States and China are shaping our supply routes, and also are shaping the way in which we as NATO members, I say we, the countries of NATO, regard threat, both now and probably also in the future.
And talking about this, do you think the final report, of course, final declaration in the summit, do you think it is approaching to 2030 report written with the kind of commissioning of Secretary General of the NATO?
Yes, to some degree. We must remember that the 2030 report is a result of extensive deliberation, consultation, extensive amount of feedback from the member countries of NATO in order to basically discuss and to better understand how to tackle the threats and the challenges of the future. Threats and challenges of the future are not only issues related to Russian aggression or China, as we've seen now and just spoke about, but also things like cybercrime, also things like hybrid warfare, also things along the lines of ultra-nationalist paramilitaries or terrorist organizations, Daesh, PKK, and other, as I mentioned, paramilitary organizations which are creating an issue for many countries around the world. And then I think what's also very important to mention, and that's a kind of a novel aspect as well, are things like the climate change. Climate change is an enormously important component because climate is a crisis multiplier. And what does that mean exactly? It means if you have climate change and you have lacking water resources, you will have increased conflict wars over the resources, both domestically and internationally. You will have increased amount of forced migration. And here we come back to the new threats as well, which are also mentioned in the new threat perspective and in the 2030 report, which are human trafficking, organized criminal groups. So yes, I think they're tackling a lot of these new threats and challenges very effectively.
And the meeting yesterday, there were very high expectations about the meeting.
Yes.
A lot of NATO experts were very excited because there were debates on 2030 report. There were debates on any strategic doctrine for NATO, its strategic concept. Do you think those expectations are met yesterday?
Well, I think what's important is context. We must remember that the starting point of Turkish-US relations is at a very low point. And that has to do with a variety of factors that I'm not going to go into detail about all of them, but there's a very heightened level of mistrust between the Turkish government and the American administration. Despite that, what we saw at the summit yesterday and in the bilateral meetings as well is positive developments when it comes to Afghanistan, positive developments when it comes to putting focus on criminal organizations, cybercrime, and hybrid warfare. And I think when we look more carefully at what was discussed, according to the press statement released by President Erdoğan and also by American President Biden, progress and development was mentioned multiple times. Attention to Afghanistan and the airport in Kabul was mentioned. Perhaps there's a role for Hungary and Pakistan along Turkey. And these are areas which are positive, and there are also other areas which were mentioned, which I would also deem positive, including the setup of a direct line between Greece and Turkey, notably an area of a lot of contentions. I think both leaders said, let's have a calm summer.
Yeah.
So hopefully that will be the case.
Yeah, and final question about Turkey-NATO relation. You mentioned a little bit the Turkey-Greece tension, but there are other issues on Eastern Mediterranean and other things. What do you think? Do you think this relationship will evolve after this summit?
I think one has to be cautious about the positive developments of this summit. Summits have a tendency to also be a lot of communication. We have to see whether the promises and discussions will carry substance on a longer term. Now, Erdoğan and Biden both agreed to have a continued dialogue and exchange between defense and foreign ministers as a follow-up to the conference, which is a positive step in order to tackle some of these issues. And here, I think it's important to mention that there is, number one, scope for increased dialogue and work in selected areas where the US and Turkey can work together, less contentious areas, notably climate change, notably Afghanistan, and notably also criminal organization, human trafficking, smuggling, and so on. And here there's also a role for the EU and EU member countries of NATO, who can both be interlocutors, but who can also help expand on relations with Turkey in areas where there is mutual interest. And those areas, of course, include the JCPOA and the Iran deal, energy towards Iran and other countries in the East, which can also lower tensions and increase the trade capacity. And then, of course, it's important also when approaching these issues to remember that none of these things exist in a vacuum. The EU-Turkey relationship also lay at the forefront of making sure that Turkey has a good relationship with NATO and with EU-NATO countries. That means we have to refocus again on France having a good relationship with Turkey, Germany continuing a good relationship with Turkey, and that these cordial ties are kept going, but also that things like the customs union and other EU-Turkey related areas have a positive progress.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.